Hello and welcome to this special edition of the broadcast. You're watching WION. My name is Mohammed Saleh. Now, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has ruled out the possibility of a ceasefire, stating that a ceasefire at this moment would be tantamount to surrender. So as Israel continues to pound the Gaza Strip, the death toll has now in fact risen to over 8,300 people. At least about 40% of all those who have been killed in the Gaza Strip in this campaign of relentless bombing that Israel has carried out are said to be children. Many have in fact dubbed this even as a war on Gaza's children. On the domestic front, Netanyahu is also increasingly facing flack for his lack of clarity on how to get the hostages back from Hamas's custody. So the question, of course, is this: does Israel at this moment have a concrete, workable plan to get back its own hostages? Now, another controversy that's also blown in the face of Israel is a controversial document that's been prepared by the Israeli Intelligence Ministry, which states that Israel would seek to evict 2.3 million Gazan citizens and then transfer them into the Sinai desert in Egypt. Now, Israel says that this is just a concept paper and not official policy document. But this is where it all comes down to. Now, remember, this violence in fact broke out on the 7th of October after Hamas carried out its biggest incursion and killed almost about 1,400 Israelis. And from there on, what we've witnessed is violence that just continues to get worse and worse. So there are several questions for which there are no immediate answers, being what is Israel's game plan from here on? What happens to the Gaza Strip and also to the Palestinian civilians living in the Gaza Strip once the war ends? Now, to try and give us a perspective on this, we're being joined by Professor Glenn Deason. He's a professor of international relations and he's joining us on this broadcast. Now, Professor, there are many issues on which, at this point of time, people across the world are wondering about. Today, of course, is day 23 of this conflict. Israel has continued with its relentless campaign of bombing the Gaza Strip. The incursion into the Gaza Strip has also begun in terms of the ground offensive. Does Israel have a clear plan on how it wants to proceed in the Gaza Strip?
Well, it's unclear if they have a clear plan, but definitely they're not communicating a clear plan. I think that this narrative that they have to completely defeat Hamas, otherwise it will be a victory for Hamas, it seems strange because there's no real way to defeat all of Hamas unless you essentially level all of Gaza or invade the whole place, and this is not possible unless the Israelis get caught in a war in which they would lose significantly. So if they're going to take out all of Hamas, this would require to push the Palestinians out of Gaza, as you see they've been doing in the north. So defeating Hamas could mean the same as ethnically cleansing Gaza, pushing, as this policy paper, or not policy paper, but concept paper suggested, was to push these 2.3 million people into Egypt.
Absolutely. I'll come to the concept paper in just a bit, but I want to talk about the Israeli military strategy. Now, the Israelis, on the face of it, they say that they want to defeat Hamas, for which they've carried out this campaign of relentless bombing the Gaza Strip. But many, of course, would turn around and say that if Israel wants to defeat Hamas, it should go after the Hamas leadership, which is not even present in the Gaza Strip, because there is a large part of the Hamas leadership which in fact is stationed in other nations, like for instance Qatar. Is Israel even clear in terms of what it wants to do with Hamas, or is it getting confused in terms of just going after these Hamas fighters on the ground and it is ignoring the Hamas leadership, which could actually have a lot of bearing on Hamas's activities?
Well, definitely, and this is part of the weakness of the strategy. But again, this is why I think one has to look at these two objectives, what to do with Hamas, but also the wider Palestinian problem for Israel, because to a large extent, Israel had some benefits in seeing Hamas being the representative of Gaza, because if they have to deal with the West Bank or other more moderate forces, they couldn't simply call them terrorists and bomb them. So I think that it's an easier way to deal with Hamas in terms of not having to engage with diplomacy, because a key problem for Israel is the demographics. I mean, only a few months ago, the Times of Israel posted an article where they pointed that there's about 7.45 million Jews versus 7.5 Palestinian and non-Arab Jews. Non-Jewish Arabs. So in other words, the Times of Israel was stating the Jews are now a minority in the state of Israel. So how do you deal with this? You have two options. You can have the two-state solution, but the Israelis already undermined this. So what can you do? You can either have apartheid state, but then you're going to have uprisings like you did now, or you have to do some ethnic cleansing or genocide. So I don't see a third option really. So this is. So merely focusing on Hamas, I don't think that addresses the wider issue of how Israel sees its main challenge.
You know, it's interesting that you brought up the two-state solution. This was something that was talked about a lot. But the fact is, in the last 20 years, with increasing Israeli settlements, you know, in the West Bank, effectively what Israel has done is that it has rendered the two-state solution almost impossible, because a lot of the territory in the West Bank is now occupied by Israeli settlements that are deemed illegal by the United Nations. So this of course, you know, buries the two-state solution. But is there, do you think, a one-state solution that is possible, where people, irrespective of their religion and ethnicities, can enjoy the same equal rights? Because that's something that can be done. Or otherwise continue with a system that is discriminatory and that is widely described as a system of apartheid.
Well, this is the problem, because if the Jewish people say they want a Jewish state, then a democratic Jewish state would actually be eventually a minority if they're not already a minority. So then it wouldn't be a Jewish state anymore. So this is the key problem. So the only alternative then of living in the same state would be one set of rules for the Jewish people and another set of rules for the rest, especially then for the Palestinians. And this is why it's referred to as an apartheid state, if you see the way people were living in the West Bank and in Gaza. Now, but the problem is, yes, I mentioned that living under a system of oppression like this is going to lead to violent uprising. So in the long run, there would be in the interest of Israel then to remove them. And again, removing means two things. Either you push them out of the country, or out of the territory they're now, which is ethnic cleansing, or destroying them, which is genocide. So this is not many other options, which is why this is such a terrifying and dangerous position which we're currently in.
You know, it's terrifying that we're even talking about stuff such as this in the year 2023. One would have thought that these are things that would have been confined to history books. But what we are witnessing at this moment unfold is really shocking. And to talk about this concept paper that is in fact surfaced, that is said to be drafted by the Israeli Intelligence Ministry. Professor Thiessen, you know, this is quite clearly the eviction of 2.3 million Palestinians from their homes and to push them into the Sinai Desert. That is what this concept paper talks about. You know, how do you think the international community, of course, would react to this?
Well, so far, a lot of the rhetoric, especially from the United States, has been, why don't the Arabs do something? You know, why doesn't Egypt open its borders to take in some refugees to help them? If they care, that's what they would do. But, and that's a reasonable argument. But at the other side of that argument would be if Egypt would do that, they would effectively open the door and give a green light to Israel to carry out an ethnic cleansing by opening the border. So this is the problem. And so far, I think the West, we should have, with some humanitarian principles, been looking for some kind of a settlement. Ideally, 20 years ago, or it's actually sooner, with this two-state solution. But instead, you hear people like Biden, when you hear this, thousands of children being killed, his response is to suggest that perhaps the numbers have been inflated, and there's not that many kids who have been killed. I mean, this is just horrible responses.
How responsible do you think
hear the same from the EU?
How responsible do you think it is, at this moment, for the American president to in fact say that, these are numbers that are put out by the Gaza's health ministry, and therefore these numbers are not credible?
Well, this is what I mentioned, that having Hamas represent the Palestinians is somewhat favorable to also the United States, because you can now just denounce everything as being the words of terrorists, which we shouldn't trust at all. But again, it's not just the United States. The European Union with Ursula von der Leyen, they've going full in support of this. So now, if this turns out to be a massive ethnic cleansing, this is a very different European Union from what we've known before. So it's really, really a dark path we're going down. And this is at the same time as the US is going full in on this conflict, which would very easily spread across the Middle East. They're at the same time fighting this proxy war against Russia and possibly starting another one with China. So the whole world, could rip at the seams very quickly.
At the time that this bout of violence started, although the conflict is an old one, the conflict dates back to 1948, where 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes, resulting in the creation of Israel. But this conflict, it started with the Hamas incursion that took place on the 7th of October. Immediately afterwards, there was a lot of sympathy and solidarity with the state of Israel. But since the Israeli response began, and since those horrific images that have started coming out of Gaza, Israel seems to be losing, the global narrative in terms of sympathy that it had been getting. And even the vote at the United Nations General Assembly clearly pointed out that 120 countries wanted a truce, while only about 14 nations, led by the United States and Israel, were against the humanitarian truce that was being talked about at the United Nations General Assembly. The question that I want to ask you is, how much further can the Israelis, backed by the Americans, proceed with what they are doing at this moment in the Gaza Strip? And how much further do you think the public opinion would favor them?
Well, I think they've been depleting the sympathy, because remember when Hamas attacked, they committed some truly horrific acts against Israeli civilians. And especially for, in Europe, given that the horrific history of genocide of the Jewish people there, people immediately have will evoke very poor memories. And there was a huge sympathy for Israel. And, generally people, because of this, have a lot of sympathy, feelings very supportive of Israel. But so they were willing to give a lot of leeway in order for Israel to revenge this, even if it wouldn't have any constructive conclusion or consequences. But nonetheless, when they see this becoming almost like carpet bombing of one of the most heavily dense populated areas in the world, where half the population are underage, with every bomb, with every new child dying, a lot of this sympathy is going away. You saw the same after the 9/11 attacks on the United States. The whole world was very sympathetic to the United States, but then they saw the U.S. taking advantage of this by effectively deciding to take out a lot of its adversaries, and seeing that the world had given it green light to bomb away. And as they continued this, the sympathy went away, and now a lot of countries perceive the United States to be, almost a terrorist state itself. So I think that this is the danger of Israel. So I think people who want the best for Israel, they would want some restraint, because this can very easily get out of control, and Israel can destroy itself if it continues down this path.
Absolutely indeed. Professor Diesen, thank you very much indeed, sir, for joining us and getting us that perspective there.
My pleasure.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.